The fog rolled down the Appalachian slopes like a living thing that night, swallowing the dirt roads, the rusted mailboxes, and the sound of anything human. Locals said the woods behind the old Carter Ridge were cursed, too quiet even for the crickets, too still for the wind. Somewhere deep in those woods, past the fallen mines and rotting church steeples, a family lived that the rest of town had long stopped claiming as their own. They were the last of their bloodline, what was left after generations of kin marrying kin, flesh turning against flesh until birth itself became a gamble between life and monstrosity. The story began when the crying stopped. For weeks, a faint, pitiful sound had drifted across the valley from their cabin, a baby's wail that echoed through the night and made dogs howl from miles away. Then, one morning, there was nothing. Not a sound. Just silence thick enough to choke on. That's when the rumors began again. That the Carters had given birth to another wrong child. That they'd done what their ancestors always did when something came out of the womb not quite right. Buried it before the sun could see. No one dared go up there, not anymore. But sometimes, when the fog lifted just right, you could see shapes moving near the tree line, barefoot figures, hunched and pale, dragging something wrapped in burlap across the field. And if you stood quiet enough, you could hear it, the sound of dirt being moved. Shovel scraping against rock. Breath caught between prayer and madness. Somewhere under that same soil, something small was still trying to breathe. The story begins in a dying Appalachian town, tucked so far into the mountains that sunlight barely reaches through the thick canopy of trees. The people who remain there live with the kind of silence that grows from generations of fear and superstition. Whispers drift between the rusted general store and the leaning church, always returning to the same name, the family that lives beyond the mining ridge. They are not spoken of openly, only in fragments and warnings. Some say they are cursed, others claim they chose to be. The truth is that no one really knows how long they've been there, surviving in isolation where even the dirt seems older than memory. Their land sits where the old coal tunnels collapsed decades ago, sealing off an entire section of forest that the county never bothered to reclaim. It is a place the locals avoid, where trees grow twisted and streams run the color of rust, and where strange noises echo on moonless nights. The family's origins are buried in rumor. Generations ago, when the mines were still open, the Carters, or what little remains of that name, were said to have refused to move into town. They lived off what they could grow, what they could trap, and what they could make with their hands. Over time, their children stopped attending school, their papers stopped being filed, and their faces vanished from census lists. Each new generation was born from the last, blood folding back on itself until the family's name became both legend and warning. Hunters claimed to have glimpsed them once in a while, pale shapes slipping between the trees, clothes made from old flour sacks, eyes that caught the light like an animal's. No one ever followed them home. As decades passed, the world outside forgot the town, and the town forgot the family. But their presence remained like a sickness in the soil. Stray dogs returned from the ridge with their fur matted and eyes clouded white. Children who wandered too far into the woods came back speaking of faces watching them from holes in the ground. A preacher once tried to bring them salvation, carrying a Bible and a cross made from oak, but he was never seen again. Only his truck was found, door hanging open, radio still whispering static. By then, even the bravest locals agreed that whatever lived beyond that ridge wasn't meant to be disturbed. The Carter family had become a ghost story told in hushed voices, a living scar left on the land where bloodlines turned inward and time forgot how to move forward. The silence of the ridge was broken the day a stranger arrived, a government social worker named Daniel Hurst, sent after a missing child report surfaced in an old file that no one had touched in years. The case should have been simple, just paperwork and a welfare check, but the details were so vague that even the county clerk seemed uneasy handing them over. The file contained only a last name, Carter, and a faded address that no longer appeared on any map. Locals warned him not to bother, insisting that whatever was up there wanted to be left alone. But Daniel was new to the region, eager to prove himself, and skeptical of the mountain folklore that everyone treated like law. He packed a flashlight, a map that ended in blank space, and drove until the road turned to dirt and the trees swallowed the sky. The air grew heavier the deeper he went, the signal on his phone dying before he even reached the foothills. The forest seemed to absorb sound, so quiet that even the crunch of gravel under his boots felt like an intrusion. He passed the remnants of old cabins and mine shafts, their entrances sealed by decades of rot and vines. Every step forward felt like stepping further back in time. Then he saw it, a wooden sign nailed to a crooked post, the paint so faded it barely read "Keep Out." Beyond that point, the path narrowed to a trail, flanked by skeletal trees and strips of mist that clung to his ankles. It was there that he noticed the smell, sweet, sick, and earthy, like decay buried shallow. By the time he reached the ridge, night had already begun to fall, and the fog had thickened into a wall. In the distance, faint through the white haze, he spotted the outline of a cabin, its roof sagging, smoke rising weakly from a cracked chimney. A single light flickered inside, too dim to be electric. He called out, but no one answered. Only the forest replied, creaking and breathing around him like something alive. As he stepped closer, he saw movement at the window, someone small, watching him. The figure vanished before he could blink. A feeling crept over him then, slow and cold, that he had crossed into a place untouched by time, a place that did not want him there. Still, he walked on, driven by duty and the echo of that lost child's name. When he reached the front door, the hinges groaned like an animal waking. Inside, the air was heavy with rot and smoke, and from somewhere deep within the cabin came a sound he couldn't mistake, a faint, wet cough, followed by a whisper that seemed to know his name. Daniel stepped through the threshold and into a world that smelled of rot, ash, and something faintly metallic. The cabin wasn't just old, it felt ancient, as if it had been built before anyone kept records of such things. The walls were darkened by soot, the floorboards warped from dampness, and every corner seemed to move with the flicker of shadows cast by the oil lamp on the table. His flashlight beam caught shapes that made his stomach turn, animal bones strung together like wind chimes, jars filled with what looked like hair and teeth, and a wooden crucifix nailed upside down over the doorway. It wasn't the home of a family, it was a shrine to something far older, far darker than he could name. He called out again, his voice trembling slightly this time, and from the far end of the room came the slow shuffle of feet. An old woman emerged from the darkness, her skin the color of candle wax, her eyes so clouded they barely seemed to see. Yet she looked directly at him. Her mouth moved before any sound came out, and when it did, it was little more than a whisper, dry, rasping, and cracked. She said he shouldn't have come. Her words carried no malice, only certainty, as if she knew what would follow long before he did. Behind her, Daniel noticed others, faces half hidden in shadow, watching him from doorways and gaps in the walls. None of them spoke. Their eyes, pale and watery, followed his every move like predators unsure whether to attack or flee. He asked about the missing child, about the reports that had brought him there, but the woman only shook her head. "Ain't no children here," she said, though her gaze darted toward a locked door near the back of the room. The others stiffened when he noticed it. There was a low hum in the air now, a kind of rhythm that came from the floor itself, as if something beneath the house was breathing. The smell was stronger near that door, and he thought he could hear faint scratching from behind it. When he stepped closer, the family murmured in unison, low and trembling, their words blurring into a kind of prayer. Outside, through the cracks in the cabin wall, Daniel saw that the property extended far beyond the main structure. Scattered around the clearing were smaller shacks, half buried in the soil, their doors sealed with planks and ropes. Between them stood wooden crosses and piles of stone, makeshift graves, hundreds of them, stretching into the woods. It was then he realized that this was not just a home. It was a compound. A place where generations had been born, lived, and died without ever leaving the ridge, and where the ground itself seemed to remember every secret ever buried beneath it. The locked door at the back of the cabin gnawed at Daniel's mind long after the old woman told him to leave it alone. Something about the way her voice cracked when she said there were no children here betrayed the lie she was trying to protect. Each time he glanced toward that door, the rest of the family seemed to stiffen, as if afraid he might open it. Their murmured prayers grew louder, and the air grew heavier, thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. The old woman shuffled toward him again, clutching a rosary made of bone and twine, her lips trembling as she muttered words he couldn't understand. Her voice carried a tremor of fear, not for herself, but for whatever was trapped behind that door. Daniel waited until the family's attention wavered, until the candlelight flickered low and their chanting faded into the hum of the storm outside. Then, quietly, he reached for the latch. The wood moaned under his touch, brittle with age, and when the door creaked open, the stench hit him like a physical force. The room beyond was no bigger than a closet, and the air inside was wet and warm, like breath. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a small figure crouched in the corner. For a moment, he thought it was a doll, limbs too thin, head too large, skin pale as paper. But then it moved. The sound it made wasn't a cry or a word, but something between the two, a strangled moan that clawed its way out of a throat too weak to speak. Daniel stepped closer, the light trembling in his hand. What he saw made his breath hitch. The child's face was unlike anything he'd ever seen. One side was normal, soft, human, fragile, but the other was sunken and distorted, as if the bone beneath had never formed right. Its eyes were mismatched, one bright blue, the other milky white, rolling aimlessly toward the sound of his footsteps. Thin strands of hair clung to a scalp riddled with scars, and its body shook under a blanket that smelled of mold and blood. The old woman appeared behind him, her voice breaking into a sob as she pleaded for him not to touch it. "He weren't meant for the light," she whispered. "God didn't make him right." It was then Daniel realized the truth. The family hadn't hidden the child out of cruelty, but out of shame, maybe even superstition. Years of inbreeding had twisted their bloodline into something that defied nature, and this child, this fragile creature with two faces, was the living proof of their curse. As the storm outside rattled the cabin walls, Daniel saw something flicker in the child's cloudy eye, a reflection of himself, small and terrified, caught in the gaze of something that should never have been born. That night, the mountain was swallowed in a storm so fierce that it seemed the sky itself was cracking open. Rain pounded the cabin roof, leaking through every rotten seam, but inside, the family moved with quiet purpose. Daniel watched from the corner, unseen, as they gathered in a slow, solemn procession around the child's room. The old woman led them, her bone rosary clutched tight, whispering prayers that mixed old scripture with words Daniel had never heard before. Their faces were pale and still, lit only by candlelight, eyes hollow with conviction. The child sat motionless on the floor, its breath shallow, its mismatched eyes blinking in confusion as they wrapped it in rough burlap and tied it with coarse rope. No one cried. No one hesitated. It was as if this act had been rehearsed for generations. Daniel's heart pounded as realization sank in. They were preparing for something far worse than isolation. The old woman muttered that the blood must be cleaned, that the sickness in their line needed to be buried before it spread. Her voice trembled with both fear and faith. To her, this wasn't murder. It was purification. She said the words like they had been spoken many times before, words that had kept the family alive in the shadows of those mountains long after the world outside forgot them. When the rain eased, the family moved as one, carrying the small, wrapped figure out into the yard. Daniel followed them quietly, the beam of his flashlight trembling in his grip. The clearing behind the cabin was scattered with makeshift crosses and shallow mounds, old graves, some fresh, some caved in from years of erosion. At the center of it all, a new hole waited, dug into the soft earth, water pooling at its edges from the storm. The old woman began to chant again, the others joining her in low harmony, a haunting melody that rose and fell with the wind. The child whimpered once, a sound that pierced through Daniel's chest, but no one flinched. They placed it into the earth with slow, reverent movements, covering it with layers of dirt until the sound stopped. Daniel wanted to run forward, to stop them, to scream, but fear rooted him to the ground. The family stood over the grave, hands joined, whispering that the blood was now cleansed. The rain started again, washing the soil smooth as if the ground itself wanted to hide the deed. In that moment, Daniel realized he wasn't just witnessing a crime, he was watching the final act of a ritual older than memory, one that had turned love, faith, and guilt into something monstrous. The storm swallowed their voices, but he could still hear the faintest sound beneath the thunder, a muffled gasp, fragile and human, coming from under the earth. Daniel waited until the family had gone back inside, their silhouettes fading behind the wavering light of the cabin window. The storm had softened into a steady drizzle, and the night air carried the scent of wet soil and smoke. Every sound seemed amplified, the creak of the trees, the distant howl of a coyote, the pulse of his own heart thudding in his ears. He stood frozen for what felt like hours, unable to shake the image of the child being lowered into the ground. His rational mind battled with disbelief, trying to convince itself that what he had seen couldn't be real, that no one could bury their own blood alive and call it salvation. But then came the faintest sound, so soft he thought he imagined it at first, a whimper, muffled and weak, rising from the fresh mound of dirt. He stumbled forward, slipping on the slick mud as he dropped to his knees beside the grave. The rain had already begun to wash the soil down in thin streams, revealing bits of burlap beneath. His hands moved before he could think, clawing at the dirt, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The ground was cold, heavy, and clinging, as if it resisted his efforts to dig. The more he unearthed, the louder the sound became, faint cries, wet and choked, still alive. Panic surged through him, every instinct screaming to move faster. He tore at the burlap, his fingers bleeding from the rough rope, and when the fabric finally split open, the small, pale face beneath stared back at him with clouded eyes. The child was breathing, shallow, broken, but alive. Daniel cradled it in his arms, feeling the weak flutter of its heart against his chest. Its skin was icy, lips turning blue, and yet it made no sound now, only a slow exhale that shivered through the air. He whispered reassurances, meaningless words meant to comfort himself as much as the child. But before he could stand, a noise came from behind him, a low creak of the cabin door opening. Lantern light spilled across the yard, and figures began to emerge, silent and deliberate, their faces unreadable. The old woman stepped forward first, her voice shaking but resolute. "You can't take him," she said softly. "He belongs to the ground." Daniel's grip tightened, his heart pounding as the family drew closer. He looked down at the child, still struggling to breathe, its eyes rolling between life and darkness. The rain fell harder again, drumming against the earth, drowning out the whispers around him. In that moment, he understood he was standing on cursed land, a place where death wasn't the end but a tradition, and that by saving the child, he had defied something sacred to them, something that had kept their family bound in fear for generations. The following morning, the storm had passed, but the forest remained heavy with mist. Daniel sat inside the cabin, his clothes drenched and his hands trembling as he flipped through a pile of old papers and photographs he had found in a wooden chest. The family had gone silent, watching him from the corners of the room like shadows, but they didn't stop him. It was as if they wanted him to see, to understand the burden that had shaped them. The papers were brittle, written in a shaky script that spanned nearly a century. Family records, birth certificates, marriage documents, all repeating the same surnames over and over. Brothers marrying sisters, cousins wedded before their teenage years, children born without official names. The pattern was endless, circling back upon itself until it was impossible to tell where one generation ended and another began. Among the papers were photographs, their edges curled and stained from time. In the oldest ones, the family looked ordinary: miners, farmers, mothers holding children on their laps. But as the years went on, the faces began to change. Eyes misaligned, jaws uneven, limbs twisted or shortened. It wasn't just deformity, it was decay, the slow erosion of a bloodline collapsing inward. Daniel could see the fear in their eyes, the desperation hidden behind those stiff poses. Some photos had been scratched out, faces blackened with ash, as if the family themselves couldn't bear to remember. He realized the Carters had never escaped the isolation of these mountains, they had become prisoners of it, passing their curse through generations of guilt and necessity. In the bottom of the chest, he found a leather-bound journal belonging to someone named Abigail Carter, written in the early 1900s. Her entries were rambling, fragmented, her handwriting descending into near madness. She wrote about the curse of the blood, about how their ancestors had defied the will of God by keeping their lineage pure in the wrong way. She spoke of voices that came from the ground, telling her that the only way to cleanse their sin was through burial, that every tainted child must be returned to the earth before the sickness spread. Each generation, she claimed, carried both the guilt and the duty. Daniel read the final entry twice, unable to breathe. "The mountain keeps what is ours," she wrote. "And the dirt remembers our names." When he looked up from the journal, the old woman was standing over him, her cloudy eyes fixed on his face. She didn't ask what he'd read. She only whispered, "Now you know why we can't stop. The blood remembers." The words hung in the air like a curse too old to be broken, and for the first time, Daniel felt the weight of centuries pressing down on the cabin walls. 3 days passed after the night Daniel dug up the grave, and by the time the county sheriff arrived at the ridge, the storm had wiped away most traces of what had happened. The family said little, only that the stranger had come uninvited and that the child was gone. They spoke with calm detachment, their words practiced, as if this was not the first time such questions had been asked. Daniel's truck was found abandoned near the tree line, the keys still in the ignition, his flashlight lying in the mud. The sheriff searched the cabin, found the graves, the bones, the jars of hair and teeth, but no sign of the child. The old woman claimed it had been taken back, though she wouldn't say by what or whom. The sheriff left shaken, filing the case as a disappearance. But in town, whispers began again, darker than before. The first to claim they saw the child was a farmer named Harold Green. He swore that one evening, while walking near the creek at the edge of the ridge, he saw a small figure standing in the water, still as a statue. He said it looked like a child, its skin gray and slick with mud, its head slightly tilted as if listening. When he called out, it didn't move, it only turned its face toward him, and he realized the eyes were wrong, one clear and one clouded, both fixed on him in silence. He ran before he could see more, but by morning the story had already spread across the valley. Others came forward, each with their own version. Some said they saw footprints too small and too perfect in the riverbank mud. Others claimed they heard crying near the old graves after midnight, a sound that faded whenever anyone got close. The townsfolk grew fearful again, locking their doors at sunset and warning children not to wander near the ridge. Rumors took shape in the fog. Some believed Daniel had freed something that should have stayed buried, others whispered that the family's curse had taken new form, that the child was no longer human but something caught between life and death. The more the stories spread, the less anyone wanted to go near that part of the woods. And yet, those who lived closest to the ridge swore that sometimes, just before dawn, they could see a figure standing at the edge of the clearing where the Carter's cabin once stood, small and silent, watching. They said it never moved, never spoke, and that when the first light of morning touched its face, it vanished, leaving behind only the smell of wet earth and the faint echo of breathing where no one should have been. When authorities finally returned to the ridge after the sightings spread through the valley, they found the place eerily quiet. The air was heavy with the smell of rain and smoke, but no voices, no movement, no sign of life. The cabin that had once stood crooked and sagging at the edge of the clearing was gone, burned to its foundation, leaving only blackened timbers jutting from the earth like bones. The smaller shacks surrounding it had collapsed into themselves, half swallowed by mud and moss. The graves that had stretched across the yard were freshly disturbed, the soil turned, as though every one of them had been reopened. What unnerved the sheriff most was that there were no footprints leading away from the scene. It looked as if the family had simply dissolved into the earth, taken by the mountain that had kept them hidden for generations. Inside the ashes of the main cabin, investigators found remnants of belongings that told a story of hurried departure, half-burned photographs, a child's shoe, a cracked mirror streaked with fingerprints. Near the remains of the hearth lay a circle of stones and the charred outline of symbols carved into the floorboards. Whatever fire had consumed the cabin seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. The air was still warm, the scent of burnt wood mingling with something sour and human. They found no bodies, no signs of struggle, nothing to explain where the Carters had gone. Only the graves spoke for them, and even those whispered confusion. Some had been filled in again, others left gaping open, with empty burlap sacks tangled in the weeds. Daniel's belongings were discovered near the creek, his soaked notebook, the leather journal of Abigail Carter, and a broken voice recorder caked in mud. When they played the tape later that week, what they heard silenced the room. At first, only static filled the speaker, but beneath it came the faint sound of breathing, uneven and close. Then a man's voice, Daniel's, murmuring something incoherent, followed by a pause and a faint, rhythmic thudding, like soil being packed down. A child's voice rose faintly under the noise, whispering words that no one could fully make out, except for one chilling line that repeated near the end, "They put me back in the ground." The recording ended with a sharp crack and silence. The investigation was closed within a month, labeled an unsolved disappearance. But those who lived nearby said the mountain had simply reclaimed its own. The forest grew denser around the ridge, swallowing the last traces of the Carter family. Still, when the wind carried right, people swore they could hear something echoing through the trees, soft, labored breaths rising from beneath the soil, as if the ground itself was still trying to breathe. Months passed, and the story of the Carter family faded from official record, reduced to rumor and ghost talk among the few who still lived near the ridge. The burned clearing became a place no one dared to approach. Hunters avoided it even in daylight, claiming their dogs refused to cross the tree line, whining and pulling back with their tails between their legs. The forest had changed, its silence no longer felt empty but watchful, the kind that pressed against the skin and made the air seem alive. Rain pooled in the hollow where the cabin once stood, forming a shallow pond that never dried, no matter the season. Locals called it the still water, and some swore that when the wind was quiet, ripples appeared on the surface even when nothing touched it. One autumn evening, a group of local boys, testing their courage, ventured up to the ridge. They carried flashlights and a camera, determined to prove the stories were nothing but mountain superstition. They laughed as they climbed, but the higher they went, the quieter the forest became. The laughter died when they reached the clearing. The air was thick and cold, the ground soft and uneven. When one boy shone his light toward the pond, the beam caught something half buried in the mud, an old tape recorder, rusted but intact. Out of curiosity, they took it home and tried to play it. The sound that came through was faint, but enough to freeze them in place. Breathing again, close and uneven, followed by a man's voice whispering prayers, then silence. Finally, a child's voice, slow and wet with mud, whispering the same words the sheriff had once heard on the earlier tape, "They put me back in the ground." By morning, the boys returned the recorder to where they had found it, leaving it on the edge of the pond. None of them spoke about what they heard again. Within weeks, 2 of the boys' families moved out of town, claiming they couldn't sleep, that they heard something scratching at their windows each night. The locals stopped going near the ridge altogether, even in daylight. Those who stayed said the mist there had grown thicker, clinging low to the earth as if guarding something buried beneath it. Years later, a forest ranger marking new boundaries stumbled upon the same clearing. He saw the pond, the crosses made from sticks, and beside them, a single stone carved crudely with a child's name. When he leaned closer, he thought he heard a sound from beneath the soil, a slow inhale, faint but deliberate, as if the earth itself was breathing, remembering the life it had once swallowed whole.